Hi, in this video I'm going to show you the watercolor techniques. The first half of them are the ones that are the most commonly used, and then the second half are some interesting textures you can make without using brushes, including a couple ways to remove paint. So with all watercolor painting, you've got to think about your brush and your paper are somewhere on a spectrum from totally dry to totally wet. And these first four techniques, I call them the big four blank on blank techniques. And the first word, the first blank there, is going to be the state of your brush. The second word is the state of the paper. This first technique, wet on wet, just means your brush is really wet, really loaded full of wet paint water, and your paper is wet as well. It's a really good idea to get your colors pre-mixed beforehand in your palette, because if you get your clean water on your paper, which you have to do, and then you realize, oh, I don't have any colors mixed, and you're scrambling to get those mixed quickly, your paper might dry out. And so by the time you put your paint in, you have to start over and re-wet your paper, and it just becomes a whole thing. This is a really fun technique because you can tip your board or your paper and let colors run into each other. They'll bleed in really interesting, unpredictable ways, which I love. You get all kinds of fun surprises and happy accidents. And this is really useful for anything with blurry washes where there's soft edges between all of your brush strokes. So things like skies or any kind of background stuff where you want things to look blurred out. There's all kinds of great ways to use wet on wet. Our second technique is wet on dry. So your brush is wet, it's loaded full of paint, and then your paper is fully dry. So this is really useful for any shapes with clearly defined outer edges. Basically, you just put a mark down and it stays exactly where the brush went, and the edges stay sharp and clear. Our next technique in the big four is dry on wet. Now your brush will never be fully dry. It's always going to have a little bit of water in it, to pick up the paint. But it's relatively dry. It's only got a little bit of water and a lot of paint in it. And then your paper is wet. But if your paper is super flooded and really, really wet, every technique will just turn into wet on wet, right? Everything will just bleed. So with this one, your brush is relatively dry. Your paper's wet, but not crazy puddles of water in it. This is really handy for any shapes with semi-soft edges. So when you put your marks down, they'll bleed just a little bit, and they aren't going to totally disappear like wet on wet, but they also won't be so sharp and crisp like wet on dry that we just looked at. Our last technique of the big four is dry on dry, which you'll see more commonly called dry brush. And surprise, your brush has very little water in it, and your paper is also totally dry. And if you load a bunch of paint in your brush with barely any water, and you lightly just drag it across the dry paper, your paint is going to catch on all the little ridges on the paper, which are called tooth, and it creates this really nice speckly, broken, grainy texture. Now, you don't have to do it straight onto white paper like I'm doing. You can also have other paint down, and if it's totally dry, you can use dry brush on top just to add some texture and grit to some object or surface that you've already painted. All right, so there's your big four, your ways to think about that spectrum of is the brush dry or wet, and is the paper dry or wet. All of these next techniques are going to fall somewhere within those spectrums, right? And some of them will even combine multiple of those big four techniques. Next up, we have even wash. This is just a layer of uniform color across a big area. You can do this with wet on wet or wet on dry. The temptation here, I see a lot of beginners put their first marks down and notice that they're looking kind of streaky, and then they brush the paint around a lot to try and even things out. I know it seems intuitive to do that, but resist that urge. Leave it alone. You've got to trust the water. It will bleed and even out over time. And if you paint a bunch on top and brush it around, it'll actually end up more streaky by the time it dries. That's the hardest thing with even wash. If you're worried about it, you can also tilt your board or paper up and down to spread the paint out more evenly and let it flow into itself. But just avoid overworking it. Gradient wash is the same as even wash, except you're also smoothly transitioning between multiple colors. So get your first color as pigmented as you want, as saturated as you want, load that onto the brush and put a brush stroke down. And then you're going to dip your brush in a little bit of water to dilute that color, and overlapping your other brush stroke, put your next one down. Think of it like mowing the lawn, right? You want to overlap a little bit. You don't want weird gaps showing up in between. And then you continue that until it fades out. And then if you're doing a second or even a third color, same thing, right? Start with the most pigmented area of that color, and then as you want it to fade, just get more and more water on your brush, and it'll create a smooth transition. Just like even wash, don't brush it around too much or almost at all if you can help it. Let the water do the work, and it'll bleed and create a nice smooth transition. Glazing is when you paint transparent layers onto existing dry layers of paint. So think about stacking sheets of stained glass together. I've got my yellow layer dry here, and then I'm putting pure blue on top, thinly and transparently, and the yellow is going to show right through, so they mix, so then I end up with green. Same thing when I apply some red later on, the yellow is going to show through, and I get this orange. There's some other colors mixed in, so it's not super pure here, but you get the gist. With watercolor, you always want to be working light to dark. And if you let those light layers dry, you can get some really nice detail as you're adding your dark shapes. So if you really want distinct, sharper edged, darker or medium colors on top of a light area, glazing is great for that. Charging in or color dropping, this is a fun one. This is just adding new colors into a damp surface of existing colors. So you've put on one layer, one wash, and it's still a little bit wet, and you start adding small variations of a bunch of different colors in there. You get this really complex, natural looking surface. Think of this as wet on damp. So it's kind of like the wet on wet idea, except it isn't all going to bleed together so much. You'll get a little more clarity and more distinct colors and shapes going on. Really nothing in nature is going to be one consistent color, or even if you're looking at something human made, it might be technically one color, but it'll have different lighting on it and different shadows and textures, so it won't be completely flat and uniform. Color dropping is a really great way to create that variety that we see in everything around us. There's a lot of times where I'm feeling down about a painting, and all of my painting techniques are negative painting techniques. But this isn't it. We're talking about a specific one that's on purpose, okay? This is called pushing puddles as well. So if you have a positive shape, think about like an actual object in your scene, usually something that's more towards the front, then this is painting around it into the background. The best way to do that is put a puddle of your paint into the middle of an open negative shape, so in your background area. And then you're going to take your brush and push that puddle outward, making sure to keep that paint activated, which means just wet and flowing. And you'll push that puddle until it touches the edge of your positive shape. Notice how I keep adding a little bit of water and more pigment as I'm expanding this paint puddle around. So to keep it all activated and alive, so it all flows and has a continuous washy look instead of being chopped up in these separate shapes, I'm just making sure to bounce around between all sides of this wet paint puddle, just checking that no part of it is going to totally dry out before I'm done. All right, cool. So those techniques are going to cover almost everything that you see used in most watercolor paintings. But there are some fun things that I call effects, which are just unusual ways to alter the appearance of watercolor using other materials besides brushes, as well as a couple tricks to remove paint off your paper. This first effect is maybe my favorite. It's salting. You can just use normal kitchen salt for this, whatever you have on hand. Different grains will do different effects a little bit, but you're just sprinkling salt into damp paint. And then what salt does with water is it soaks it up, right? So all your damp water on the surface will have some pigment in it. So every salt grain is going to soak that up, and it leaves these really interesting frosty looking kind of algae-ish trails around it. If your paint is too wet, then the salt can't soak up enough to leave a mark. It just gets swamped and flooded, doesn't do anything. And if your paint's too dry, same thing, your salt's just going to sit on the paper and not leave a mark. So you want to find a happy medium of just barely damp paper, but not puddles of water sitting on the surface. Be patient with this. You won't see it working immediately, but if you leave it for a good minute or two, you'll start to see the effects. Once your paper is totally dry, you can brush the salt grains off and you get these wonderful, sparkly looking effects. This next technique is also super fun. You can spritz your painting with a spray bottle with water in it or rubbing alcohol, similar effect. You can just drip pure water in. You can flick paint in with different pigments in it and speckle on top of your paper. This also works best if your paper isn't too wet. So in this first example, I thought I had let it dry enough, but because there's still a lot of standing water on there, when I spray more and flick more drops in, they all just bleed together and it turns into a big wet on wet, which is fine, but then you lose the whole point of flicking water in. So in this other example, I let it almost dry, but it was still a little bit damp. And then when I spray it with the spray bottle or flick a brush onto it, every little mark pushes pigment away. So when those little splatters of water hit the paper, it spreads out the pigment around it, and you get this really beautiful, complex, technical looking texture that I couldn't go in and paint by hand in a million years, but just did it all on its own. Next up, we have sponging. It's what it sounds like. You're applying paint with a sponge. I think natural sponges work best because you get more variation in the texture and you don't have these straight corners and edges. But all I had was a kitchen sponge, and that also has its own interesting texture to it. This also works best when the paper is either damp or totally dry. If it's too wet, your sponge will actually just absorb paint and water off the paper, or your marks will just bleed in and disappear. I don't actually use scratching all that much, but it is an interesting technique that's worth having in your toolbox. You're basically drawing into the paper with a hard tool like the back of a pencil or a brush, and then when you paint over it, a little more paint will settle into those scratch grooves, and so there'll be darker lines there. The thing about scratching is, first off, in this example, my black brush, the paint starts coming off the back of the brush into the paper, which I don't love, so I had to switch to this metal pencil stylus thing. And also, once you scratch in, of course, it's permanently indented, so you can't unscratch your paper. But it's interesting, cool technique. Tried to get some tree and cloud type lines in here. Tried to draw my cat in here, but you can't really tell. But it's still fun, worth experimenting with. All right, so this last category of techniques is subtractive techniques, or removing paint from the paper. One of the trickiest things about watercolor is it's so transparent. So if you make something that's too dark and then you need to remove it, you can't just cover it up with lighter opaque paint. You'll see right through it. But there are a couple workarounds here to actually sort of erase paint most of the way from your paper. This first subtractive technique is called lifting or blotting. And this works best if your paint is still wet and you decide you need to remove some. You can just hit it with a clean paper towel or a clean brush, and you can actually wipe off most of that paint. If it stays on there and dries, it's a little harder. You have to take a brush that has no paint on it and really clean water and just very patiently paint back and forth with just water. It'll start to pick up your pigment and lift it off the paper. And then you can dab it with a paper towel and go back and forth to get a little more of it off. But it'll probably never fully remove, and you just have to be really gentle, because if you do this too much or you press too hard, you'll actually mess up the grain of the paper. And then if you paint back over it, you'll get some weird speckly textures that look like you started to tear the paper up. So just be careful with this. Don't rely on it ahead of time, but it's really handy if you're in an emergency. Masking is another useful subtractive technique. Think of this as subtracting paint from areas before you even paint anything around them. So you're just blocking areas off. And you can use tape for this. You could even take the time to cut your tape into really intricate shapes with an X-Acto knife or something. Or I'm also using masking fluid here, which you can paint on. Just make sure you're using a brush that you're okay with only using for masking fluid, because it really dries into this rubbery substance and it's hard to wash out of a brush. Once it dries on your paper, then you can paint whatever you want. Let your paint fully dry, and then you can just rub it with your fingers or an eraser, and that rubbery masking fluid substance peels off. It's super satisfying, and you should just have white paper underneath. If you choose, you could actually do a whole layer of paint underneath all this too, and then mask certain areas off. And then when you paint your second layer, let it all dry, remove your mask. You'll still have that first color showing through if you don't want pure white. Okay, so last and maybe least is scraping. This is just straight up using a little knife or palette knife to scrape paint off the paper, creating some white spots. I use this really rarely, but it's useful for things like sparkles on water. Winslow Homer would use it for that purpose occasionally, or to carve in a little thin white line, like a rope or the mast of a boat, rather than painting around that little strip of white the entire time. You just have to be really careful with this because, of course, you're permanently scraping off the top layer of your paper. Also, you really have to make sure that your paper is totally dry before you scrape it. If it's even a little bit damp, you're going to start to peel off big sections of paper on accident. So just make sure it's absolutely dry before you touch it. And there you have it. There's my breakdown on the watercolor techniques. Basically, anytime I'm approaching a watercolor, I'm always thinking about which of these techniques would look the best to paint water or sky or these rocks or a face or a fruit or an animal or whatever it is I'm looking at. I'm just combining these techniques, and some of them more than others even. Like the first few I'm always using. So hopefully you found that helpful, and as you practice them, you'll start to understand and have an intuitive sense of how to translate them into finished paintings on your own. Thanks for watching.